Obrigado a todos enfim, aos participantes por estarem aqui um pouco esta uma hora connosco. Hi everyone, glad to have you all with us attending this webinar. For the next 40 minutes, we'll try to give you some insights regarding cyber threat landscape in financial services sector based on lessons learned of our incident team colleagues. We hope you'll find it useful. Just giving you a short resume about information security and cybersecurity unit at Crowe in Portugal. I promise I won't take more than 3-4 minutes, and feel free to involve us in the near future, even for just a brainstorm about these issues. Thank you. So, in Crowe, Portugal, namely Crowe Advisory Portugal, we address the information security and cybersecurity issues, addressing it on a holistic approach to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, based on the 3 pillars: people, process, and technologies. Gustavo, please. Then we have an approach that is basically mapping the legal and regulatory and reputational requirements to the best standards and frameworks landscapes. You can see over here a figure about that resumes more or less the NIST, CSF, and also the National Cybersecurity Reference Framework in Portugal, and the main or the more important standards, international standard that we used to address regarding these issues. Next, please, Gustavo. And finally, this is our integrated management model, where we incorporate the governance model regarding the organization's profile and the compliance requirements. As I said, I think I didn't waste more than 3 minutes. And now let's go for important. Thank you all. As Gustavo said, if you have any questions, please fulfill it in the questions and answers in the chat. Thank you. Gustavo?
Thank you, Luis. Next on the agenda is Jake Simpson. A bit of background. Jake is a seasoned cybersecurity leader with over 13 years of experience directing and delivering complex security engagements across multiple industries. He has led teams through more than 1,300 cyber incident response matters, supporting organizations through high-pressure breaches and helping them strengthen their resilience in the aftermath. Jake is a trusted advisor to boards and executive teams and has served as a virtual CISO for clients operating in diverse regulatory environments, including publicly traded organizations. His work spans security assessments, penetration testing, and strategic security program development tailored to healthcare, financial services, manufacturing, and other critical sectors. Beyond incident response, Jake's portfolio includes specialized cybersecurity projects designed to enhance organizational maturity and reduce risk exposure. Jake remains a reliable authority in cyber operations, risk management, and strategic security leadership, and is very well known for his ability to navigate technical, regulatory, and business complexities. Over to you, Jake.
Yeah, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Gustavo, for that wonderful introduction. If you wouldn't mind just kind of bumping the slide one more. So I'm just going to pause here real quick and just talk about Crowe cyber offerings writ large. So I think really from our perspective, we try to model our offerings to meet any client wherever they need to be, and regardless of locale as well. And as you can tell from our webinar here today, this is really a joint operation between Crowe Portugal, Crowe US, but from a cyber perspective, we try to show up as one team, being able to execute on all of these different pieces and facets of cybersecurity program. Gustavo, we can go to the next slide, please. So this, I think, will kick off the beginning portion of our incident response kind of cyber threat intelligence briefing. As Gustavo had mentioned in my background, I've spent a number of years, over 10 years in particular, just working on incident response. And as a result of that, really kind of started to realize that the data that we were getting on the front end, investigating these types of incidents and all of the different types of hacks that were happening, allowed us an opportunity to then take that information and distribute it out to people in the form of cyber threat intelligence that was really cutting edge and timely and impactful, ultimately to the end client to be able to stay ahead of the threats and the threat actors that are out there. So I always find that it helps to just set the table a little bit and actually start defining the threat. So when we start talking about the threat from a cyber perspective and threat actors in general, we typically like to bucket them into three distinct categories. First, you have your nation states. China, Russia, Iran are some of the more adversarial ones, at least from our perspective here in the United States. That then is followed closely by the organized crime groups. Some you may have heard of, some are lesser known, but kind of some of the big ones that have made the news recently are Scattered Spider, Qilin, and Clop. And then finally, the hacktivists. We don't really see many of them, but they're definitely out there. And those are really commonly, known as like the anonymous groups or LulzSec. Given that we're also focused on financial services today, and something that's probably not on this slide, but something that should be mentioned for maybe a fourth bucket of threats specific to financial services would be the insider threat. And we'll spend some time talking about all three of these as we go forward. But now that we've kind of got a basic understanding of the kind of threat groups and how we bucket them, let's take a look at the objectives. And Gustavo, can you move on to the next slide, please, sir? Thank you. So when we start talking about what are these distinct threat groups actually going after, really from a nation state perspective, generally what we see when doing the incident response and kind of working on the forensic investigation portions of responding to these incidents is that their main aims are really going to be around intelligence collection or furthering some sort of political agenda or objective, or in a lot of cases, some sort of economic or industrial espionage. The organized crime groups, they tend to stick to really anything that will allow them to make money. So that monetization piece is something that is kind of their core effort. And the way they do that is usually through data theft or ransomware that has some extortion layer, layered into it, where they're demanding money for either release of the stolen files or, to unlock your data if they've locked it up with some sort of encrypting malware, a la the ransomware piece. And then finally, the hacktivist groups, like I was saying, we don't see too many of them, but they're definitely out there. And they're definitely more prolific in, defacing of websites or launching denial of service types attacks. And their main objectives really are to just kind of further either a social gain or a political gain, just depending upon what group is out there and who's operating. Something that we're noticing that I think is really important is that while we've defined these threat groups into three different buckets, the lines are really starting to blur between, is this a nation state or is this an organized crime group? Is this a hacktivist or a nation state? So you'll notice that we have hybrid warfare kind of in italics on all three of these different attack groups. And that's really just because we're starting to see that shift where hacktivist groups are starting to potentially work on the side of nation states. Organized crimes are working with nation states. And so what were these nice defined buckets that we previously had are starting to blur. Unfortunately, that just makes our job all that harder from a defense perspective, but is something that I think is a really interesting trend that folks need to know about. Gustavo, next slide, please, sir. Thank you. So when we start talking about the current state of cyber, like what is it that we are actually seeing today on the front lines? And I think it really can be categorized into two main themes. One is smarter adversaries, and then two is just evolving tactics, techniques, and procedures. We're really starting to see both the cyber criminals from the organized crime elements as well as the nation state actors becoming more organized, more patient, and more well-funded in their operations. And that can be really explained, or you can really see that in just some of the recent incidents that we've been paying attention to. Actually, a few days ago, it's just now hitting the news. Chinese linked threat actors have started, or has come about that they were attacking updater packages for a popular application called Notepad++. We've assessed this to really be a wide-scale espionage attempt to infect many, yet only target specific groups of people. So it's really an interesting kind of play, and shows just the capabilities that these nation state kind of threat actor groups have to be able to go after and to actually perpetuate a supply chain compromise of that scale. That then tends into shifting techniques, shifting tactics, shifting procedures, things that we're seeing in that from the organized crime side, we're starting to see a shift away from ransomware to this multifaceted extortion and business email compromise type piece as well. And that can be categorized in two incidents that we've actually worked in the last couple of weeks. One was a ransomware incident that happened at a manufacturing organization here in the United States. The threat actors were able to just walk right in the front door using credentials to their virtual private network that didn't have any sort of multi-factor authentication on it. Unfortunately, with ransomware, it does involve the systems being completely encrypted. And then in return, you pay for the decryption key to unlock these systems and these files. A lot of times you can stop that process or not necessarily have to pay the threat actors if you have good backups. And in this case, the organization did have good backups, but they still paid the ransom. And the reason why they paid the ransom is because the threat actors, not only did they lock up the files, but they stole the data on the way out before they hit the ransomware. So they actually ended up paying because of the sensitivity of the data that was taken by the threat actors. And I think this one was around $8 million US is where they settled that from a payment perspective. But the only reason why they didn't have any operational downtime, well, had some, but not significant. But the only reason that really drove them to paying was because of the sensitivity of the data that was taken by the threat actors. And these threat actors are getting better at finding that sensitive data. They're using AI and automation to scale these attacks and perpetuate them faster than we can actually respond. So that unfortunately is something that we're really tracking. And I want to spend a few minutes actually digging into the artificial intelligence side of the house real quick. So Gustavo, if you could mind go to the next slide, please. So AI obviously has become all the rage. Everybody, at least from our camp and on the cyber side, on the technical side of the house, is talking about artificial intelligence, and it's rapidly becoming a favored tool of the threat actors. However, from our perspective, it's really not a reinvention of the wheel. It is not necessarily an existential threat that is going to materially change the cybersecurity landscape, but rather we view it as an accelerant. And so what it will do is it will just make the threat actors' traditional tactics and techniques and the methods at which they use to get into systems and to move laterally and to perpetuate their gains at the end of the day faster. So what that means for us is it will just continue to stress our traditional methods of detection, which unfortunately is difficult right now. But as we start to shift our focus and become a little bit more organized in that front, we do have an ability to stay ahead of these threat actors. But just wanted to talk through what we've seen. How is AI being used from a cyber threat actor perspective? And so some of the emergent patterns include in 2024, this is one that's pretty well known. There was a British engineering firm, Arup, I can never pronounce it correctly, unfortunately. They became a victim of a deepfake scam where threat actors had created synthetic identities to trick one of their finance people into sending multiple transactions up to $25 million US. This was really the first time that we saw a synthetic identity crafted by AI used in some sort of social engineering attack like this. We've seen smaller instances of this as it's been going along, but it didn't necessarily take off to the extent that we would have expected it to after we saw what happened with Arup in 2024. More so what we're seeing is in 2025 of last year, March of last year, we really started to see malware samples and other tools used by threat actors that when we pick them apart and we do the decompilation of the malware through the forensics process, we can tell that they originated from a large language model or an AI tool. That's really what we start to see a lot of, and it's kind of on the forefront of what we're finding when we do these investigations, is that it's not this kind of Hollywood-esque kind of big deep fake of a synthetic identity. They're there, but they're not all that common. Typically what we're seeing is just this, they're using the tools that are out there to help write new malware or to change their code a little bit faster and stay ahead of the antivirus systems and our detective methodologies. But what's interesting though is that, again, the threat actors are getting smarter. In 2020, in September of last year, Anthropic, the makers of the Claude AI tool, they observed some suspicious activity occurring in that tool set. And in particular, what they were able to determine was that there was a nation state that was using the Claude tool to orchestrate attacks across scale that no human necessarily wouldn't have been able to do. So why that sticks out to us and why that's interesting is because it's not a reinvention of the wheel per se, but it's just the threat actors they're getting better at using the tools that are out there to extend their reach and to make things happen a lot faster. And we start to see evidence of that from OpenAI themselves. In December of last year, they released a report on some of their model capabilities at developing working zero-day exploits against well-defended systems or assisting in meaningful, complex, stealthy intrusion operations. GPT-5 was their model that came out in mid last year. That was about a 27% success rate. GPT 5.1 came out later last year. That metric ticked all the way up to a 76% success rate at being able to develop a working zero-day or meaningfully assist in that complex intrusion operation. So again, all of this is just kind of signals that are pointing to it's not really changing the game. It's just making things a heck of a lot faster, which we need to just be ready for and account for that in our defensive postures. Gustavo, next slide, please. And in talking about some forward-looking, future-looking things, one of the things that we're tracking as well, in addition to the artificial intelligence side of things, is quantum computing. I'm sure we've all heard of quantum computing and that it will break today's, encryption algorithms that we have, which most people tend to think about their banks and their financial services in this regard of, oh no, what happens when quantum computing comes around and now all of a sudden the link to my bank when I'm doing my banking is able to be broken. What happens then? Does that mean I'm going to lose all my money? The hackers are going to be able to steal all of it? Well, that's a theoretical risk, and it may happen eventually, but this is really a future and high complexity threat. What we would really like to draw attention to in this is to not focus necessarily on, say, the existential kind of theoretical threat, but rather what's actually happening today. What are we seeing that effectively makes quantum computing a moot point and that we don't necessarily have to worry about it per se, but what should we be concerned about right now? And that's the practical reality of that. A lot of the breaches that we work, they don't involve the threat actors breaking encryption. They're mostly just accessing data that's already in an unencrypted state, that they're accessing through compromised endpoints and credentials, misconfigurations on databases and cloud storage are another huge issue. So really the call to action here and why we kind of wanted to just put this in this discussion here today is that encryption it's got all this buzz around it with quantum computing and people are worried about it, but encryption only protects data where it's properly applied. And businesses really today, they're not even at the level where we're encrypting the data that needs to be encrypted. Because if the data is exposed in plain text, quantum-enabled decryption becomes irrelevant, unfortunately. So wanted to just give you that kind of peace of mind, if you will, but also to just have a bit of a call to action on things that we're seeing when we're working these breaches. We should really be focusing on the practical realities of today. Gustavo, next slide, please. Thank you. So we talked about the types of threat actors, we talked about their objectives, we've talked about AI, and then we talked about quantum computing and some future ideas that we're tracking on our end. But I want to kind of bring it all back together and specifically talk about the intersection of financial institutions, particularly European financial institutions, and then the cybersecurity pathways. So why are European financial institutions prime targets? Well, it really just comes down to a lot of the just both direct monetization pathways, but also the fact that it's a highly systemically important system within the EU from an economy and marketplace perspective. And it's also very highly interconnected, right? When we start talking about some of the open banking processes and protocols, SEPA, SWIFT, some of the fintech partnerships, that high level of digital connectivity and interconnectedness, unfortunately, does allow for a bigger attack surface for the threat actors to go after. Of course, when we think back to what are the threat actors going after with this monetization piece and the pieces of things that they're really focusing on, they're trying to make as much money as we can. As a result of that, right, we start looking at all of these different pieces coming together in the threat landscape that's out there. The fact that there's this highly interconnected ecosystem makes it a prime target. So specifically, what are we seeing? What are the big things that we're observing when we are doing incident response, impacting specifically the EU financial sector? So from a threat landscape perspective, obviously, ransomware and operational disruption is still a really huge kind of thing that we're seeing. But I would say by and large, the primary threats that are facing financial institutions right now are credential theft and account takeover, usually leading from some sort of business email compromise to perpetuate payment fraud. We're seeing a lot of SEPA payment fraud and invoice manipulation that is really targeting all different types of businesses, but also targeting the financial services and financial institutions that serve these businesses that are out there. So, I mean, I think really it's the same thing here we see in the US, but it is all really just tied back to the money-making ability of these threat actors and of these criminals. And again, it's not a, big vulnerability that they're going after or anything else like that. They're going after the credentials and the identities of these people. So if we were to say, let's focus on one particular area, that's something that we're telling our clients all the time. Hey, you need to really be focusing on how you're managing identities, how you're managing credentials, how you're verifying the authenticity of people and their accounts as you go through and kind of use these technologies in the course of business. So with that, Gustavo, can you jump to the next slide, please? So what do we do about it? And something that I want to talk through and a concept that I want to bring to the forefront is this idea of defense in depth. There's a lot of examples of, wow, how can I actually withstand all of these different threats that are coming at me? There's no one silver bullet per se, but rather it is a collection of different tools and technologies and processes and people that all come together to make a holistic security posture or that defense in depth piece. So at the core, you have data. You need to protect the data. You need to identify the data. You need to minimize the data to prevent it from either being exposed unnecessarily or maintain the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the data, which is something that NIS2 directive is really, really hammering on. Well, in order to do that, you need technology. right? So you need to have some good tools and good processes around using that technology for defining and tracking the data. Well, then you will need a team. You need some operations to come along and actually work on collaborating and aligning all of the business expectations with the technology and with the data. And then, of course, you need to finally wrap up with some sort of security layer around it. But it's really not a one size kind of easy button, one size fits all type approach. It has to be layered. I think the best way that I can describe it is your security posture needs to be like an onion. Have multiple different layers, all doing protective, functions at various levels and layers within the organizations. Gustavo, can you go to the next slide, please, sir? Which really gets to this concept of this business-informed risk mitigation. And so we talked about this defense in depth concept, and from a technology perspective and technical teams, it makes sense to us. But something that we commonly find is that there is a disconnect between the business side and then the technology side. And so having a business-informed risk mitigation program, or being a business-informed or a cyber-resilient business, can really help you either withstand or outlast a cyber incident if you have one, but then also puts you into a better position to actually prevent a cyber incident from occurring on the front end. So this graphic here, I snagged this a couple of weeks ago because I thought it was very interesting and a really good piece to communicate this concept, in that if we have a look at the center of the circle there, right, we have a cyber incident, bang, something happens, and then there's this period of absorption, right? We have to continue running the business, we have to continue maintaining operations, but then we also need to recover to the state of standard operations that we were at previously. Well, by incorporating some of these defense in depth concepts, and by having this connection between technology and the business, particularly from the cyber side of the house, we can start to shrink that circle and shrink the amount of time that it takes for you to then absorb and recover from an incident when it occurs. So essentially saying that those cyber resilient businesses are really at the forefront of being able to shrink the circle, or the V in the middle of that figure there. So how do you do that? Gustavo, next slide, please, sir. That's something that we're going to talk about, is how do we do that? What are these practical steps that we can take? From our perspective on the incident response side of the house, running a tabletop exercise is probably one of the best things that you can do to prepare yourself and your organization to withstand a cyber incident. So what is a tabletop exercise? Well, it's a scenario-based simulation of a realistic cyber incident that focuses on the decision-making and coordination of all of the teams within the business, not just the technical execution with the IT team or the security team, but rather let's have legal involved, let's have accounting involved, let's have all these different business functions involved. Bring everybody to the table and start actually talking about, hey, if something happens, how do we keep the lights on? How do we keep our customers happy? How do we maintain business? So what we find is that a lot of these incidents, when we do the response to them, organizations are under pressure because they're slow to make a decision. There's unclear or inconsistent roles or authority. There's communication breakdowns. So these tabletop exercises are really a great way to start surfacing some of those issues in a low-risk environment where you control all the variables. So with that, I think, Gustavo, I'm going to hand things back over to you, and then we'll let Josh continue telling us some of those more practical elements of what we can do to be cyber resilient businesses and to have defense in depth.
Excellent, and thank you for your clarity and input, Jake. Let me just tell our audience that if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat so we can go over them right before the end of this session. Okay, so please use your chat. Don't be shy, and place your questions. So now let me introduce you, Josh. Josh Reed serves as Crowe's firm-wide cyber governance, risk, and compliance leader. He has over 22 years of experience helping companies align cyber risk and compliance programs with GRC technology solutions, including third-party risk, privacy, regulatory compliance, business resilience, enterprise risk management, and internal audit. His responsibilities include overseeing the strategic management, the strategic direction of Crowe cyber and GRC technology solutions offerings, and bringing new solutions to market, focusing on cyber risk management and AI automation. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Gustavo, and thank you for everybody joining the webinar today. We can progress to the next slide here, Gustavo, and we'll start by talking a little bit, transitioning into why cyber governance is so critical for our organizations today. And Jake gave us some very good examples from a threat landscape and the things that you all are dealing with within your financial services institutions. It is something that has certainly risen to the board level. 20 years ago, for those of you who have been in cybersecurity for 20 years, it was always considered a very technical problem that needed to be dealt with by technical people. However, now with the regulatory landscape, the operational risk that cyber has introduced, all the data privacy and so forth, those things have now caused cyber to become more of a board level and enterprise risk that needs to be considered consistently. So from a regulatory standpoint, the common theme that we're seeing is that the regulators now are demanding accountability at the senior management and board level. And Jake and I have had, over the past 6 months, we've had the opportunity to meet with board members from probably close to 100 different companies represented within financial services and other industries. And they really do, the board members really do want to become more educated. They want to understand this risk much better. And they want to be involved. And so with Jake talking about tabletop walkthroughs in particular, that was a common question a lot of board members have been asking us is how can they be more involved in those tabletop walkthroughs to observe, to provide input, to provide support to the management team and cybersecurity in particular. So a very common theme that we're seeing there. Obviously, it's documented and captured in the regulatory requirements around DORA and the NIS2 articles, which we'll talk more about here in just a little bit. But that is something where, you know, the regulators are requiring more proof of evidence that the board is active and that activity is moving into the management team and operationally. And on the next slide, we'll just very quickly just cover, I want to get to some of the more specifics that you can take some action on here in just a little bit. But as far as the regulatory landscape, obviously, these are some of the top regulations that you all are dealing with and really trying to make sure that your programs and your operations are complying with these regulations. The enforcement of NIS2 is obviously something that has been very top of mind within Portugal and is going to continue to be top of mind throughout 2026. As we looked at these various regulations, some of the biggest themes that you see on the right-hand side, I already talked about the tone at the top at the board level and the management level where oversight is imperative to the organization. We are also seeing, and this is not just with these regulations, but even within the US, the regulators here are very focused on evidence and outcomes versus a maturity level that might be perceived within the organization. Maybe you have a third-party service provider that comes in and does a maturity assessment for your organization. The regulators aren't as focused on that anymore. It's certainly moved into show me the proof of evidence on how your controls are operating effectively within your environment. From an incident reporting standpoint, Jake showed the diagram where, you know, we know that incidents are going to happen, but how quickly can you manage that blast radius? How quickly can you decrease that time to recover? And what are the reporting requirements back to the regulators on when an incident does occur? So there's some inconsistency across the different regulations that are out there in terms of the timeline for reporting, the recipients who must be notified, what information must be communicated. And so it's very important for you to build those into your response procedures to make sure you understand those things so that you're complying with those various regulations. Third-party risk is a huge focus. We're seeing that from regulators here in the U.S. That plays into not just from a data protection standpoint, but also the operational resiliency when you are extremely dependent on certain third parties to provide your products and services out to the market. And so that has been a big focus with the regulators recently. And then lastly, documentation, making sure that you all the way from the board level with your memorandums, your board minutes, all the way into your cyber risk metrics and reporting and your procedures. You have very strong auditability of change management, who own and ownership of those different items within your organization. All right, Gustavo. So I wanted to transition now into a few things to consider. Basically, there's a lot of things that are on your plate, obviously, and things that you need to think about. But these are 5 things that we thought would be very helpful for you to maybe take back to your organization. These are things that we are hearing from our clients on how they can improve their programs, not just within cybersecurity, but also collaborating across the departments and different parts of the organization. And so we've got a slide that's dedicated to each one of these that we're gonna just kind of walk through quickly. If there's something you'd like to drill down into more specifically, we'd obviously be happy to talk more about some of these things, but we're gonna talk about these at a very high level for the purpose of our webinar today. So the first one is recommending the alignment of your internal controls with the various laws, regulations, and industry frameworks. So being able to test once and certify many is a common term that you maybe have heard, but making sure you have proper control alignment that does map, you can show the mappings to the various regulatory requirements that are out there. Defining your risk framework, understanding your operational risks, your enterprise risks, and then flowing into your IT and cyber risks, but then building some automation, being able to define measurable metrics, key risk indicators that you can measure on an automated basis, on a continuous basis, and being able to tie back to your overall risk register that you may have for your company. Enhancing your third-party risk program. We'll talk more about that. I already touched on that one. Streamlining your incident processes to have a feedback loop. So that's a common thing that we're seeing now, where leveraging your cyber threat intelligence and your incident response teams to gather that information, some of the things Jake just talked about a little while ago, and helping to strengthen and harden those cyber controls for your organization based on what's going on out in the market, and creating that feedback loop. And then lastly, leveraging a GRC platform. We'll talk about that as well, how to automate some of these processes. So Gustavo, let's go to the first one. And this may be a new organization that you haven't heard of yet, the Cyber Risk Institute. It's something that's gaining significant traction in the United States and also with several different global regulators who are acknowledging the use of the Cyber Risk Institute profile. And the reason this is gaining traction is because in August of 2025, the FFIEC, which is a council here in the United States that works with several regulatory US-based bodies, they sunset the FFIEC CAT, the Cybersecurity Assessment Tool, in August. There's just so much change going on in the market around cybersecurity that they said, there's other frameworks that are keeping things more up to date. They're able to have a broader reach of the controls that need to be considered. And so they basically have decided to sunset the CAT and are recommending to leverage the NIST cybersecurity framework, the CIS CSC controls, or the CRI profile. And there is a link here to the website. You can just go there and just download the profile to see what that entails. It is built on ISO 27001, so many of you may leverage that as a common framework. It's also based on NIST CSF, but they basically work with a number of different financial services institutions, not just in the US, but around the globe. You can see in the bottom left corner about 150 service members today. There's a few examples of some of the global institutions that are leveraging and members of the CRI profile, but they have come together to build a financial services specific profile that can be used by member institutions. So a lot of valuable content that's there. You can download the high level information for free, or you can also become a member. We are also seeing the several technology products start to embed the CRI profile into their products. So various GRC technology tools have CRI assessments that you can do. Automated control monitoring tools have also built-in control monitoring that you can do mapped to CRI. So those are just a few examples. And in terms of the roadmap, they are continuing to work with more regulatory bodies in the European Union and in the UK. They have a new profile coming out in April. I think they're actually in London next week, to be honest, to be specific. London, they are having a workshop next week. So if you have any team members there who would be interested in maybe learning more about that, we would be happy to provide some information around that workshop going on next week in London. But they are also providing translations in Portuguese and Spanish that will be rolled out in March of 2026, which will be extremely valuable. And so just something to kind of consider, being able to have that common control framework and mappings to over 30 laws and regulations. I think in the next quarter, they're going to have the new release with an additional 10 to 12 more regulations mapped in. But this will give you a good comprehensive framework to leverage and at least reference for your organization. Okay, Gustavo. Recommendation number 2 is around key risk indicators. And the big thing around this, I think, is obviously you probably already have a IT risk or a cyber risk register or a library of risks that you've documented, that you're managing those risks, you're reporting those up to your board and your management team. But the big thing we're starting to get more requests around is how do we have more, move from a qualitative to more of a quantitative measurement around these risks. Not so much fully dependent on the risk assessments we may do that sometimes can be very subjective in those risk assessments, but how do we get more quantitative measures? And so we've been working with a number of companies over the past few years to develop a library of key risk indicators, measurable metrics that you can tie back to your existing risk register, and then being able to automate those KRIs by gathering data. There's data that's out there in your environment that you can pull that information, convert that into a metric, and then be able to manage the trends and monitor the trends on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis to see if those metrics are staying within your threshold, within your risk appetite, or are they starting to trend towards breaching and going above and beyond maybe your risk appetite in that area. So just a good way to manage that information. We'll talk more in just a few minutes on how this can be automated leveraging a GRC platform. But this is something we're seeing quite commonly now with a lot of organizations to automate more risk monitoring. Recommendation number 3, I talked about third-party risk is a very a top area of regulatory concern. From a people, process, and technology standpoint, we're seeing organizations who do want to focus a cyber threat intelligence briefing, kind of like we're talking about now, and how these third parties can be subject to these breaches, to these business disruptions, which can then turn into disruption for your core operations as well. And so Jake and I have had a lot of conversation over the past several weeks around doing tabletop exercises, even with vendors involved. So not just within your core team, but understanding maybe core technology components that you are highly dependent on. What if those technologies are disrupted and it impacts your operation? So thinking about doing these tabletop exercises, not just with your core team, but also with key vendors as well. With processes that in particular, take a look at your existing contracts, making sure that you understand the requirements within DORA, NIS2, GDPR, and the EU AI Act in particular, and making sure that your contract language with those third parties is helping you maintain compliance with those various regulations. So just a few things for consideration. We're seeing some technologies come onto the market over the past year or two that are very AI enabled to help you gain more leverage with assessing third parties. So it's very difficult for a team of one or two or three, oftentimes, that are managing that volume of third parties coming into your banking environment or your insurance environment, and you have to assess them very quickly as part of the onboarding process. In order to do that proper due diligence, some of the AI capabilities that are now available are helping companies manage that volume much more effectively. From an incident response standpoint, this is kind of one other area that we're seeing quite a bit of automation starting to take place. And in the past, the cyber threat intelligence team, the incident response team, the GRC team, they were very siloed by nature. They were kind of doing their own responsibilities. But we're seeing areas now where that information that's gathered and analyzed by the CTI team and the incident response team can be fed in to a centralized GRC platform to help understand likelihood of a risk turning into an incident, or what the impact might be if that incident were to occur. Understanding how that correlates with your existing control profiles and the effectiveness of your controls that you may be testing and auditing against. So that information, that value chain of data from cyber threat intel, incident response, the risks that are the internal business risks that might impact, and then the controls in place to mitigate. That whole linkage is something that can be now correlated through the use of AI and some things that we're seeing other companies leverage. And this is a lot of information that is obviously gathered within a cyber threat intelligence team or a broader cyber team. Difficult to manage that with spreadsheets and with PowerPoint and Word documents. You really do need a centralized GRC platform to help manage all of that information. There's a lot of correlation that has to happen. There's a lot of workflow of notifications to the right people at the right time. And so just did want to kind of mention a few platforms that are out there that do provide that linkage between your cyber threat team, your GRC team, risk and beyond enterprise risk. A few examples, you may have these already within your environment today. ServiceNow and Archer are two very popular ones that have been around for quite some time. SmartSuite is one that is an AI native GRC tool that is very much a up and coming tool that's being adopted by a lot of companies here in the US specifically. Might be something to worth taking a look at. Something that has regulations built into the platform, that has integrations to pull in the KRI data, has the workflow capability built in. And so as you start to automate these and correlate this data, again, you can kind of see some of the different use cases that we're seeing companies start to leverage down in the bottom left-hand corner. Some of those AI-based Gen AI capability to auto-generate risk assessments, auto-generate policies and business continuity plans, but then also more of the agentic, the emergence of agents that are starting to provide that leverage within these teams to correlate the data and create actions, create remediations that need to be performed. So a lot that we covered within a very quick 25 minutes here, along with Jake's information. I know we wanted to leave a little bit of time for some questions. And so, Gustavo, I'll turn it over to you.
Very good, Josh. Thank you for your insights. Very clear insights. Yes, we do have a question from the audience. I believe Rui Souza has a question, maybe to Jake, but maybe Jake and Josh can coordinate this. So Rui asks, given the latest advances in quantum computing and their impact on encryption, are there currently any plans to strengthen the security mechanisms across different organizations?
Sure, I can certainly take a first pass at that question, and Rui, thank you for that question. It is a good one. So yes, but no. So yes, in the sense that there's a lot of people that are from a research perspective, from an academic perspective, and from a business perspective that are thinking about these things. Particularly in Europe, right? We have the Euro QCI, which is the quantum communication infrastructure that's been doing a lot of initiatives and research around developing quantum secure communication networks across Europe. The European Space Agency has also been doing some research into this front. Some of the bigger organizations like Cloudflare, Apple, Amazon, and Google have all been doing some of this, the same level of research, and just trying to think through what does this future state look like. Because we're still really far away from it, if I were to put a metric around it, and again, this is fuzzy math, so don't take this as a hard and fast figure. We're a good 15, 20 years away from it even really becoming a thing where we're starting to see impact from the result of quantum-enabled encryption or decryption in this case. So from a business perspective, there's really not much to do at this point in time. But again, I still think that the advice that we provided on that slide earlier, specifically around the encryption problem, is the most prudent to follow, in that it's not, let's worry about the quantum computing piece, but let's see what we have in our environment currently today that isn't encrypted, that should be encrypted. Can we minimize the amount of data that's potentially exposed if we were to have an incident occur? So that's where I would shift the focus to. But to answer your question broadly, there are a number of agencies that are doing the research on that.
Thank you, Jake. Josh, you wanna take on this?
I'm good. Jake covered it well. I'm good on that side.
I just can add some other input. I believe not so much as Jake said. Not there's a lot of research regarding the security mechanisms across different organizations, but already important players regarding the encryption technology, namely the digital signing, post-quantum encryption, and in that field, there are already some players. In Europe, Crowe, in Europe, we are working with a player, Sign Quantum, right, to prepare for this kind of attacks based on blockchain platforms. Yeah.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you. Rui just messaged me saying all clear. Thanks. Okay, very, very good. I think these if there are any other questions, I don't believe we do have quite no. Okay. So yes, I think this brings us to the end of today's session, and I would like to thank all our speakers and participants for joining in. The full recording will be soon available at Crowe's Portugal YouTube channel. And if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out through our website, www.crowe.pt. And thank you once again. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you.
See you soon.